The protagonists are well suited to the task, Professors John Lennox and Richard Dawkins. John Lennox is a mathematician and philosopher of science, and Richard Dawkins, until recently, Charles Simonyi Chair for the...
There is a war being fought right now. Not with weapons, not on a battlefield you can find on any map. It is a war being fought with words, with logic, with history.
The universe is rationally intelligible because there's a creator God behind it. Now, how do you account for the rational intelligibility of the universe?
And with one of the oldest and most complete Bibles ever assembled by human hands. On one side, Richard Dawkins, the Oxford evolutionary biologist, the best-selling author of the God Delusion, the man who once wrote that the God of the Old Testament is, and I am quoting directly here, the most unpleasant character in all fiction. The man who has, for decades, told the world that the Bible is not a sacred text. It is mythology. It is fabrication. It is, in his own framing, the kind of chaotically cobbled-together anthology you would expect from hundreds of anonymous authors spanning 9 centuries of revision and distortion. On the other side, John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, a man who holds 3 doctorates from Cambridge, Oxford, and Cardiff, a philosopher of science, a Christian apologist who has looked Richard Dawkins in the eye, on stage, in front of live audiences and millions of television viewers, and refused to blink. And now, at the center of this collision, sits something neither man invented and neither man can easily dismiss, the Ethiopian Bible. Stay with me, because what is about to unfold in this video is not just a religious debate. It is a confrontation between the world's most celebrated atheist and a 2,000-year-old manuscript, tradition that survived empires, councils, colonial erasure, and deliberate suppression. And the question at the heart of it all is one that should stop you cold. What if the version of the Bible you've been told is the Bible is not actually the full story? WHO is Richard Dawkins, and what exactly is his argument? Before we get to Lennox's response, we need to understand what Dawkins actually said and why it mattered enough to ignite this entire conversation. Richard Dawkins is not a man who whispers his opinions. In the God Delusion, which has sold millions of copies and arguably launched the modern New Atheism movement, Dawkins made a sweeping argument that extended far beyond evolutionary biology. He went after Scripture itself. He described the Bible as, in his words, a chaotically cobbled-together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, and copyists, unknown to us and mostly unknown to each other, spanning 9 centuries. Read that again slowly. He is not just saying God doesn't exist. He is saying the texts used to argue for God's existence are, at their root, human fabrications. Myths dressed up as revelation. Stories that got passed down, edited, embellished, and eventually given divine authority they never had. And when discussions began to circulate, particularly in online religious communities, about the Ethiopian Bible and its extraordinary breadth, Dawkins' wider argument was applied directly. If the Western Bible is fiction, then a Bible containing even more books, including texts like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, must represent an even deeper layer of mythology. More books, the argument goes, simply means more invention. Now, here is where I need you to pause. Ask yourself this question, and I want you to genuinely sit with it. Is the presence of more ancient texts evidence of more fiction, or could it be evidence of more truth that was deliberately left out? That is the question John Lennox would want you holding as we move forward. The Ethiopian Bible, what Dawkins dismisses without fully understanding. To respond to the argument, you first have to understand what the Ethiopian Bible actually is. Because most people, and I would argue this includes many of Dawkins' own readers, have never engaged with it seriously. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Bible is, by virtually every scholarly measure, the oldest and most comprehensive Bible in Christian history. It was written in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language that is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy today. It is perhaps one of the world's oldest continuously used sacred scriptures, preserved not in a museum but in living monastic communities where ancient chants still echo through stone corridors, where frankincense still burns before dawn, and where monks still read from texts that the Yadiantupran Western Church quietly stopped reading more than 1,000 years ago. The canon is broader than anything Rome, Constantinople, or Canterbury ever assembled. The narrower canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes the traditional Hebrew proto-canon, the Deuterocanon, the Prayer of Manasseh, 3rd and 4th Ezra, the Paralipomena of Jeremiah, and crucially, the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. The broader canon extends further still, incorporating texts like the Books of Synodos, the Books of Covenant, the Ethiopic Clement, and the Didaskalia. We are talking about a Bible that contains somewhere between 81 and 88 books, depending on how you count, compared to the 66 books of the Protestant canon, or the 73 of the Catholic. Now here is what I want you to understand, because this is the first crack in Dawkins' argument. These extra texts, they were not invented by Ethiopian monks. They were not fabricated in some mountain monastery to pad out a local religious tradition. The Book of Enoch, for instance, is a text of ancient Jewish origin, the earliest sections dating back to approximately the 4th century BCE. The Book of Jubilees is similarly ancient, dated by scholars to around the 2nd century BCE. And here is the part that should make anyone pause before calling these texts fiction. Both the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees appear among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let that land. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1946 and 1956 in the Qumran caves of the Judean desert, are considered by many scholars to be the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. These are not religious claims. These are manuscripts that can be physically held, chemically analyzed, and radiocarbon dated. And among those thousands of fragments recovered from 11 caves, researchers found fragments of 11 Aramaic manuscripts of parts of the Book of Enoch. They found fragments of Jubilees. These texts existed in the ancient Jewish world. They were read, studied, and preserved long before Christianity was ever codified into a canon. And in 2025, scientists pushed this discovery even further. A research team from the University of Groningen, led by archaeologist Professor Mladen Popovic, used an AI system named, remarkably, Enoch to combine radiocarbon dating with machine learning handwriting analysis on Dead Sea Scroll fragments. The results were extraordinary. Some fragments were dated up to 100 years older than previously believed. Two specific fragments, from the books of Daniel and Ecclesiastes, were dated to the time of their presumed authors. The AI achieved 85% accuracy in dating manuscript fragments, outperforming conventional methods. What this means, in plain English, is that the text Ethiopia preserved are not a later invention. They are among the oldest surviving religious manuscripts known to humanity. The Ethiopian Church did not fabricate the Book of Enoch. It preserved it, while the Western Church, through councils at Nicaea, Laodicea, and Carthage, quietly trimmed it away. So when Dawkins waves his hand and calls the Bible fiction, he is making an argument that crumbles when it comes into contact with an Ethiopian manuscript, because these texts have now been validated not by faith, but by archaeology. Enter John Lennox, the man who has done this before. Now we need to bring in the man himself. John Carson Lennox was born on the 7th of November, 1943, in Northern Ireland. He is, by any objective measure, not a man to be dismissed lightly. He holds a doctorate from Cambridge, a doctorate from Oxford, a doctorate from Cardiff. He is an emeritus professor of mathematics at Oxford University, an emeritus fellow at Green Templeton College, and the president of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. He has published over 70 mathematical papers and co-authored research-level textbooks in the Oxford Mathematical Monograph series. He is also the man who sat across from Richard Dawkins on October 3, 2007 in Birmingham, Alabama, for a debate that drew millions of viewers. He has debated Christopher Hitchens. He has faced Peter Singer. He has engaged Lawrence Krauss and Peter Atkins. And through all of it, Lennox has maintained a position that drives Dawkins and the new atheist community to frustration. That science and Christian faith are not only compatible, they are mutually reinforcing. But what makes Lennox's response to the Ethiopian Bible argument so powerful is that it operates on a level Dawkins is not prepared for. Dawkins attacks the Bible as a historical document. Lennox meets him there, but he brings a mathematician's precision and a philosopher's discipline to a space where Dawkins often relies on rhetorical force rather than careful argumentation. Let me walk you through the core of what Lennox would say, and does say, across his books, debates, and lectures, when confronted with arguments like this. The Lennox response, point by point. Point 1. Dawkins misunderstands what a canon actually is. Lennox has consistently identified a fundamental error in the way Dawkins approaches religious texts. Dawkins treats the biblical canon as though it were a monolithic document that either stands or falls as a single unit. If one part is questionable, the whole edifice collapses. If one council made political decisions about which books to include, then the entire tradition is contaminated. But this, Lennox would argue, is not how textual history works, and any historian, Christian or secular, would tell you the same. The formation of the biblical canon was not a single event. It was a long, contested, deeply human process that unfolded across centuries and geographies. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world with a continuous tradition stretching back to the 1st century AD, did not add books to the Bible. From their perspective, and from the perspective of many serious scholars, they simply never removed them. When the councils of Nicaea, Laodicea, and Carthage made decisions about which texts belonged in the Western canon, they were doing so in specific political and theological contexts. Ethiopia was not represented at those councils. Its faith had developed independently, rooted in a direct encounter with Jewish and early Christian scripture in its most ancient form. The Ethiopian church was not editing its Bible to conform to empire. It was preserving what it had always had. To call that tradition fiction is not a historical argument. It is an assumption dressed up as one. Point 2. The archaeological evidence demands intellectual honesty. Here is where Lennox, the mathematician, becomes particularly sharp. Because mathematics and science are, in his framing, not the enemies of faith. They are tools for truth-seeking. And when science produces evidence, intellectual honesty demands that you follow it where it leads. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a religious text. They are an archaeological fact. Fragments of the Book of Enoch found in Qumran Cave 4. Fragments that can be physically examined confirm that this text existed in ancient Jewish communities centuries before Christianity was codified. The Ethiopic version of 1 Enoch, preserved in Ge'ez, corresponds closely to its Aramaic prototypes recovered from the scrolls. This was not a text invented by medieval monks. This was a text copied from material that predated the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, Lennox would be the first to acknowledge that the presence of a text in the Dead Sea Scrolls does not automatically make it divinely inspired. That is a separate theological question and one he approaches with care. But what it absolutely demolishes is the claim that the Ethiopian biblical tradition is simply fiction. These are ancient documents. They have physical witnesses. They have survived not because of institutional power, but because of the devotion of communities who believed they mattered. Compare that to how Dawkins describes the Bible's formation as a chaotically assembled anthology of distortions. The evidence does not support that characterization when applied to the Ethiopian tradition. These manuscripts were not distorted, they were preserved, carried through centuries without the supporting infrastructure of Rome or the political muscle of Constantinople, preserved in Ge'ez, in monasteries carved into cliffsides, by monks who memorized their scriptures because books were too precious to risk losing. Point 3. The Book of Enoch was never fringe, it was central. This is perhaps the most striking point, and the one most likely to surprise viewers who have grown up in Western Christian traditions. The Book of Enoch was not a marginal text in early Christianity. It was quoted, cited, and treated with high regard by some of the most influential figures in the early church. The New Testament Book of Jude, which is in every Protestant and Catholic Bible, directly quotes from 1 Enoch, chapter 1, verse 9, and refers to Enoch by name. Tertullian, one of the foundational writers of early Western Christianity, mounted a spirited defense of Enoch's authority. Origen, one of the most brilliant theological minds of the ancient world, treated Enochic literature as scripture. Early church fathers, including Clement of Alexandria, were deeply familiar with the text and engaged it seriously. So when Dawkins implies that texts like the Book of Enoch are peripheral additions by fringe communities, he is arguing against the documented record of early Christian intellectual history. These texts were not marginal. They were eventually marginalized by councils, by political pressures, by the process of institutional canon formation. That is a very different thing. And Ethiopia, which was not subject to those same institutional pressures, simply never marginalized them. The Ethiopian Church preserved them because it believed they were worth preserving. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, that entirely secular archaeological discovery, have confirmed that the community at Qumran agreed. Lennox's deepest challenge to Dawkins, the question of what counts as evidence. Here is where Lennox, drawing on his background in the philosophy of science, makes his most powerful move. Dawkins' fundamental argument is empirical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and religious texts offer none. But Lennox has spent decades pointing out an internal tension in that argument. Dawkins applies rigorous evidential standards to religious claims, but he does not apply those same standards to his own philosophical commitments. The claim that the universe has no transcendent origin is itself not a scientific conclusion. It is a metaphysical assumption. And a metaphysical assumption, Lennox argues, cannot be validated by science alone. Science can tell you how things happen. It cannot tell you why there is anything at all, rather than nothing. Now bring this to the Ethiopian Bible specifically. Dawkins' argument is that these texts are fiction because they cannot be empirically verified in the way a scientific experiment can. But the archaeological record now contains physical artifacts, Dead Sea Scroll fragments, radiocarbon-dated manuscripts, AI-assisted handwriting analysis that verify the antiquity of these texts. The empirical case for their ancient origin is stronger than ever. If Dawkins is committed to following the evidence leads him somewhere uncomfortable, to texts that are not recent inventions, not medieval fabrications, not politically assembled mythologies, but ancient documents with physical, datable witnesses that survived because communities believed they were worth dying to protect. That is not what fiction looks like. The wider stakes, why this debate matters in 2026. Now here is where I want to step back and talk to you directly. Because this is not just an academic argument between two Oxford professors. Think about what is really at stake here. We live in a time when religious identity, particularly Christian identity in Africa, is growing at a remarkable rate. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church represents one of the oldest and most theologically rich expressions of Christian faith on earth. It is not a young religion looking for Western validation. It is a tradition that predates the Roman Catholic Church's current form, that preserved texts the Western world lost, and that maintained an unbroken liturgical and monastic heritage when European Christianity was still being contested by sword and fire. When someone like Dawkins applies his fiction framework to the Bible, he is not just critiquing Western Protestantism. He is, whether intentionally or not, dismissing the faith tradition of millions of Ethiopian Christians whose ancestors preserved knowledge that Western scholars are now racing to understand. That is worth taking seriously. And there is something else. The conversation around the Ethiopian Bible has exploded online in recent years. People around the world, particularly younger people, are discovering the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Kebra Nagast, the Garama Gospels for the first time. They are asking questions that were not being asked a generation ago. Questions like, who decided what went into the Bible? Who was left out of that conversation? And what have we lost because of those decisions? These are not fringe questions. They are historically serious questions, and they deserve historically serious answers. Think about what the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church actually represents historically. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century. Tradition holds that the evangelist Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch described in Acts 8, making Ethiopia one of the earliest recipients of the Christian message on record. By 330 CE, Christianity had become the official religion of the Aksumite Empire, making Ethiopia one of the first nations on earth to make that declaration. This was not a peripheral, late-arriving tradition. This was a founding church, and it maintained its canon without the interference of Roman councils, without the pressure of Western theological politics, without the Reformation's debates about which books counted. It kept what it had always had, and what it had always had included texts that Western scholars dismissed as apocryphal, until the Dead Sea Scrolls came along and said, these texts were real, they were ancient, and they mattered to the people who wrote and read them. That is the context. Dawkins is waving away when he calls these traditions fictional. He is not just disagreeing with Ethiopian theology. He is dismissing an archaeological and historical record that grows stronger with every new discovery. I want to ask you something right now, and I want you to think about it honestly before you scroll past. Dean, if a text was considered scripture by early Christians, quoted in the New Testament, physically confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and preserved for 2 millennia by a community whose faith predates the Roman Empire, at what point does calling it fiction tell us more about the person making that claim than about the text itself? What Lennox gets right, and where the real unanswered questions lie. Now, in the spirit of intellectual honesty that both Lennox and Dawkins claim to prize, let us acknowledge what remains genuinely uncertain. John Lennox does not argue that every text in the Ethiopian canon is divinely inspired in the same way. He is a careful thinker, and careful thinkers distinguish between different kinds of questions. The question of whether the Book of Enoch is ancient is a historical and archaeological question, and the evidence now leans heavily toward yes. The question of whether it is divinely inspired is a theological question, one that requires a framework Dawkins refuses to engage with seriously. What Lennox does argue, and argues compellingly, is that the dismissal of religious texts as fiction is not a scientific conclusion. It is a philosophical choice, and that choice, he contends, is made before the evidence is examined, not after. There are scholars who would agree with parts of Dawkins' critique while disagreeing with its scope. Yes, the biblical canon was shaped by human decisions. Yes, political and theological pressures influenced which texts were included and which were left out. Yes, there are historical inconsistencies in Scripture that demand careful examination rather than credulous acceptance. But human involvement in transmission does not equal fiction. The archaeological record confirms that real people, in real communities, in real historical periods, treated these texts as sacred. They copied them onto animal skins. They carried them across deserts. They chanted them in languages that have barely changed in 2,000 years. That is not the behavior of communities that believed they were preserving fiction. And here is the question that keeps serious scholars up at night. If the Qumran community treated the Book of Enoch as scripture, multiple copies, careful preservation alongside the Torah and the Psalms, and if the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained that same view for 2 millennia, and if fragments of that text survive in the Dead Sea Scrolls with physical, datable testimony, then what exactly is the intellectual basis for calling it fiction? Dawkins has never answered that question in a way that engages with the Ethiopian evidence specifically. He has never sat with the Garima Gospels. He has never grappled with what it means that Enochic fragments were among the most carefully preserved texts at Qumran. He has never acknowledged that the Book of Jubilees, a text Ethiopia has carried for 2,000 years, survives in its fullest form only in gaze. because Ethiopia alone refused to let it disappear. Lennox would say that is telling, the Garima Gospels and the final blow to the recent invention argument. There is one more piece of evidence that deserves mention, and it may be the most stunning of all. The Garima Gospels, held at Abba Garima Monastery in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. These are, by current scholarly consensus, the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts in existence. They have been carbon dated to somewhere between 330 and 650 CE, making them older than any comparable manuscript tradition in Western Christianity. They are handwritten in Ge'ez. They have never left Ethiopia. They are not in the British Museum. They are not in a Vatican vault. They are still in the monastery where they were always kept. The Ethiopian tradition did not need the West to validate its antiquity. It was ancient before the West was literate. And yet, when debates about the Bible's historical value arise, the Ethiopian tradition is almost always treated as peripheral, as exotic, as a fascinating footnote to the real Christian story centered in Rome or Canterbury or Constantinople. Lennox would recognize this immediately as a form of intellectual parochialism, the assumption that the Western tradition represents the whole of Christian truth, when in reality it represents one branch of a much wider tree. To call the Ethiopian Bible fiction is to call the Garima Gospels fiction. It is to call 2,000 years of unbroken liturgical tradition fiction. It is to call the Dead Sea Scroll fragments fiction. It is to call the early church fathers who read and cited Enoch fiction. At some point, the weight of evidence requires a different conclusion. The debate that is not over. Here is where we land. Richard Dawkins is one of the most brilliant communicators science has ever produced. His work in evolutionary biology is genuine, significant, and important. But when he moves from biology into philosophy, when he makes the leap from evolution explains life's diversity to therefore all religious texts are fiction, he is not doing science anymore. He is doing philosophy badly. And John Lennox, who has spent his career at the intersection of mathematics, philosophy, and theology, has been pointing that out for decades. The Ethiopian Bible argument is not simply one more skirmish in the ongoing culture war between atheism and religion. It is a specific, concrete test case where Dawkins' broader argument collides with a body of historical and archaeological evidence that does not cooperate with his conclusions. The texts Ethiopia preserved are ancient. They have physical witnesses. They were read by early Christians. They influenced the New Testament. They survived because real human beings believed, at the cost of enormous effort and sacrifice, that they were worth preserving. Call that whatever you want. But the one thing the evidence will not support any longer is calling it fiction. John Lennox has been saying this for a long time, in different ways, in different debates, on different stages. The Ethiopian Bible just gave that argument its sharpest edge yet. And I want to leave you with a final question, one I genuinely want you to think about after this video ends. If the Western world systematically removed texts from its Bible that were later physically confirmed in the Dead Sea Scrolls and preserved in their fullest form only in Ethiopia, what else might we be missing? And are you willing to ask that question out loud? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this video made you think, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe if you haven't. And I'll see you in the next one.